Let me begin by expressing my heartfelt thanks for the Nehru Center and the YB Chavan Center for according me this honor and giving me the opportunity to share my views with this wonderful gathering. We scholars are accustomed to speaking very happily to a group of 5, 10, it doesn't matter, but this is indeed a very, very, overwhelming number that has come, so I'm extremely grateful for that. Supriya ji and all the distinguished members of these two institutions about whom just heard some fascinating stuff. I'm truly grateful, and I too extend my best wishes for this year-long program, because I think it's a very good idea to have this dialogue series from Mumbai, which hopefully over a period of time will come together to provide a very different perspective on things. I find that when we start talking about China, the further we go away from Delhi, the more interesting the conversation begins. Delhi is rather... Delhi is, the discourse in Delhi is overwhelmingly strategic and security oriented. So while we do need to engage with those issues, I am driven as a scholar more by the even more overwhelming need to understand what we are up against now. I do believe that we have not even begun to scratch the surface of what China means, not just to us, but to the world. Chinese politics, society, culture, philosophy is still a big black hole as far as we are concerned. Add to that the language issues. So I am extremely delighted that the Mumbai dialogues allowed me to move away from, because when I was having this initial discussion about what I should speak on, Mridul was very kind. As I said, please let's move away from India-China, because that immediately brings us into a different zone. So instead of focusing on that, let me focus my talk on this big picture, the big story of our times. And indeed, it is a reflection of the vision of the organizers of these dialogues, that China has been taken up as clearly the most critical challenge. And I say challenge not in a negative sense. The challenge in its multifaceted nature, it's both positive and negative. So that's what I propose to focus on. And what I will do is divide my presentation into, say, about 45 to 50 minutes, Supriya ji. That's about it. That's what, or I'll try and finish earlier if I see that it's not quite really exciting people. But I propose to divide my presentation into 3 parts. In the first section, I would try and provide a framework for understanding this concept of global strategy. Why is it necessary to understand what a global strategy means? What makes a strategy global? And this has to be understood in the context of the world order that we find ourselves in at this juncture. The next section, I would provide a very brief historical backdrop to enable us to grasp the profile of this rising power in all its, many aspects, manifold aspects, and why a sense of history is important in understanding the contemporary face of China. And finally, in the third section, I would examine the components of China's global strategy and show how these components have led to a discourse on the China threat. The nature of the concerns and the apprehensions that are characterizing international relations today is about what kind of a power China is going to be. And at the center of these concerns is this new vision that has been unveiled by Xi Jinping when he first came to power in 2012, which is the Belt and the Road Initiative. And I intend to focus on the Belt and Road Initiative as symbolizing China's global vision and its global strategy. So that's how I would be taking you through for the next half an hour to 40 minutes. All right, to begin with some conceptual issues. Right? A wise scholar once said, and this wise scholar was none other than my own guru under whom I did my doctoral research, who incidentally hails from Maharashtra, Professor G.P. Deshpande, is pretty well known in scholarly, literary, and other circles in Maharashtra. So he had once told, when we were discussing issues about world order, he said, the problem with world order is that it is not much of an order. In fact, a paradox, it's a kind of a contradiction in terms, because the quintessential feature of a world order is its dynamic character. So this implies that we need to examine and analyze the world order in terms of both an existing situation or a given kind of a reality, and the movement or the changes that are going to produce a different kind of a reality over the short, medium, or long term. So it's both these aspects, and any concept which has an inherently dynamic notion at its core, in other words, a concept which hypothesizes movement, is also ideological. Now I'll explain what I mean by ideological here, that it involves a view of history. It involves a sense of how you see this movement from one point to the other point, from as it exists to where it is going. So how you assess this is clearly ideological. And therefore it means that it also involves a sense of history. But this history has to be understood not in the narrow sense of a chronology or events, but in the more fundamental sense of this progression. So a historical framework is necessary to be able to comprehend the kind of progression that we are seeing that is happening in the world today. The 20th century, particularly the post-World War II period, has witnessed the evolution of the concept of a worldview. Arguably, in the 19th century, not many people, particularly in the field of IR, did much or spent much time in talking about worldview, but it is really post-World War II scenario that worldview as a major component has emerged in the study of international relations. And especially when we start to deal with this notion of powers, great powers, middle powers, lesser powers, the whole discourse about understanding great power behavior is connected to how they see the world. In other words, understanding foreign policies of great powers means understanding how they perceive the world, because great powers have great interests. Great powers have global interests. Smaller powers can proceed on the basis of national interests. But the idea of global interests is inbuilt into the idea of a great power. Scholars have shown that it is the historical experience of countries that play a defining role in how they perceive the world. Or in other words, their worldview is affected by their own historical experience. But perception of the world, comprehending the existing reality, and preparing for changes then brings in the third and the last category of concepts into, that is, you will then try to shape the dynamics in your favor. That is inherent in this idea of progression. If you are looking at a movement, a progression from point one to point other, then your efforts are clearly directed in taking you to where you are most advantageously placed. And therefore, grasping a situation in all its comprehensiveness, bringing together a set of factors which will help navigate those changes, then requires a strategy for change. And the foreign policy that comes out of this kind of a conceptualization, because it's a dynamic world that you are addressing and understanding and analyzing, your foreign policy then itself would have a certain degree of flexibility to be able to respond to the dynamic nature of the world order. So this is the interplay between strategy and tactics, and that's really the kind of background to what I propose to, those are the concepts that I propose to use in understanding China's worldview and China's a global strategy is based on a vision, which is what I just outlined, that unless you have understood where you are located and where you want to go, your strategy cannot be fully comprehensive. So you need to be able to be moved by a vision of how you would like to transform the world. So in other words, it is transformative in character. So the movement essentially is from explanation to transformation. Now, proceeding from there, we can see that with that kind of a backdrop, we need to identify clearly what our core interests are. These are invariably defined in terms of sovereignty, security, development, values. I put a question mark there because there is a big debate on whether values can really actually become core interests or whether it is limited to, but we will not get into that debate. The core interest also is about the threats that you perceive at any given point of time. So that also has to do with this understanding the nature of the threat or explaining the threat and then moving towards resolving that threat. The means that are employed to safeguard those threats, which it could include an array: economic, financial, commercial, political, diplomatic, cultural, intellectual. And finally, sustainable capacity to shape those immediate surroundings, immediate context, and beyond. So it is in that sense that I say that the question of whether China has such a strategy is no longer a matter of debate. All right, now I quickly give you a bird's eye view of Chinese, of this history, and it's important to understand that it is one of the oldest and richest civilizations in the world. And consciously they see themselves not as a mere nation state, but as a civilization state. In fact, for almost 18 of the past 20 centuries, we will see that China had been the biggest economy in the world, followed by India. And it was only around 1880 that we see China beginning to fall behind Europe. From the mid-18th to the mid-19th century, we have the period of Western colonialism, exploitation, domination. And this period has been identified by the Chinese as a period of shame and humiliation. In fact, it is only with the victory of the Communist Party that China, at least that's how it comes out in their discourse and writings, that China took the first step in redressing the wrongs of history. And this notion of shame and humiliation by the West has been a major driving force in China's external posture and external relations. Till very recently, it has figured very prominently. in the Chinese foreign policy discourse and even in the domestic discourse. And that has been a great rallying factor for nationalism in China. It's only in the last 5 years that we see the lesser and lesser references to this century of shame and humiliation. Now, contemporary analysts tend to encapsulate this history from 1949 onwards in three periods. Under Mao, China stood up. Under Deng Xiaoping, China grew rich. And under Xi Jinping, China is going to become powerful. So Mao liberated China. And, it's very interesting that for many Chinese, particularly those who grew up in the 50s and 60s in China, and then also witnessed the first phase of Deng Xiaoping's changes, reforms, and getting rich kind of developments. If you talk to them and ask them, whom do you consider more important, Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping? And invariably the answer is Mao Zedong. And why? Because Mao liberated us, Jiefang. And that idea of liberation from foreign domination and foreign exploitation is something that runs very deep into the Chinese psyche. So the idea that Deng Xiaoping, of course, made us rich, fine, that's very good. But that would not have happened had Mao not liberated us. So it's a very interesting kind of a dynamic that Mao continues to animate a very strong vein of pride in the Chinese people. Of course, there are many other problematic aspects to Mao's reign, but here I'm trying to trace the idea of how China views the world. So this the West, which had dominated them and exposed, humiliated them for a century, that period has to be overcome. China has to once again emerge as powerful and as important a player in world affairs as it was before the Western domination. And nonetheless, under Mao, we see China playing the role of a revolutionary challenger. It was an ideologically divided world, bipolar politics dominated international relations, and Mao very consciously upheld and pursued an anti-imperialist policy. So imperialism was a very important category in his lexicon. Deng Xiaoping, of course, changed the paradigm. He comes along with these two cats, black or white, it doesn't matter. What matters is to grow rich. But it is also important to understand that while he opened China to the outside world and he introduced market reforms, it was strictly under state aegis. The control and dominant role of the Communist Party was not to be diluted. And this is something that is often brushed aside. China grew rich. There was no more talk of class struggle. There would be no more revolution. And above all, it would prioritize stability. And stability is something that we see even today Xi Jinping taking up as a very strong necessity for China. In fact, the tendency to equate Xi Jinping with Mao is at one level problematic, because it is true that Xi Jinping uses a lot of Mao in his politics, but there's no Maoism in Xi Jinping. Now, we are not going to see the era of mass struggle or chaos and instability. Xi Jinping, like Deng Xiaoping, very much prioritizes stability. And finally, so one can assess Deng Xiaoping's era to gradually open up to the outside world and no more revolution, but more of a conformist stance towards the new liberal capitalist order. There was a reality out there which was being shaped by the forces of globalization, and Deng Xiaoping capitalized on it with gusto. With Xi Jinping, as China becomes more powerful, Xi Jinping, of course, takes over in 2012, but China's rise China's economic rise, China's ability to now play a major role in the world economy had begun around the turn of the century. And therefore, a decade later when Xi Jinping comes, he has a very substantial basis on which to start talking in terms of now China is going to find its proper role in world affairs. So China is going to become more powerful. And significance of Xi Jinping's period is that there is a greater tendency to project China no longer as a rule taker, that it will be a rule shaper. Now, so far, we are not seeing rule shaping morphing into rule making. At this point, I would argue, a closer study shows that China has not tried to very openly defy the norms of international organizational institutions. And it has protested, it has critiqued, but it has on the whole tended to uphold and keep talking about the norms. So it is really around the time that Xi Jinping comes into power that we see this discourse on China having reached a post-conflictual phase. Now, there are two aspects here, which I will just mention because in the last 5 years particularly, things have changed. And that speaks to really the dynamism of the world order that I was saying. That 5 to 7 years ago, it was believed that China was in a post-conflictual world in the sense that even though it had some outstanding disputes with its neighbors, no country was in a position to impose a military solution on China for the resolution of those disputes. To that extent, it had become, but now, of course, we have a complete turnaround and we have a grim possibility that China is no longer in that it actually has come back into a very highly conflictual kind of a phase. And again, a little over 5 years ago, at the start of Xi Jinping's reign, it was also observed that China was becoming a much more active, assertive, and a much more significant player in its external relationship. It had begun to acquire a high degree of sophistication in the way in which its diplomatic practices were evolving. Its diplomats were engaging with greater confidence. And then, of course, we come into the era of the wolf warrior diplomacy. Suddenly, there is a turnaround. But so these two aspects, again, have now come under some sort of a debate. But in terms of understanding the third phase in Chinese evolution, we see a very dramatic shift. So China must now gain its rightful place in the sun. And the question really is, why? Why should it, what is it that makes it say that we now must have our rightful place, and how will it do it? So of course, number one, China is the most populous nation, industrial nation, let me add. China's population is roughly around 1.4 billion. India is somewhere very close. Some people say India has already surpassed China in its in population, but India is about 1.3 something. And it's the other interesting again trend historically is that you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, Europe accounted for 20% of the world's population. Today, this figure is down to 12%. And by 2050, it will drop to 7%, and it is predicted that end of 21st century, it will go down to 4%. India and China together accounting for 40% of the world population. So clearly, we have here a very significant component of power. The demographics, of course, there is another issue that China is growing old much faster, and the question that started off in the late 1990s and gathered momentum in the early years. Will China grow old before it becomes rich? And that question is once again staring, but again, it's a very complex debate. We don't have time to go into that. It's the largest economy and trading nation. Of course, no need to get into the details over here, but if we look at purely in terms of nominal GDP, United States is at the top still with 23 trillion, but China is second spot with 17 plus trillion, whereas India is just about 3.2 trillion. So largest economy and manufacturing superpower, factory of the world. Its trade and commerce is huge. And this is a very, I really love this graphic here. You can see that China is the largest trading partner for 124 countries. That's its capacity, whereas United States is now largest trading partner only for 56 countries. Total trade turnover of China is about 2.something trillion. India is at 61 billion. World-class university system. These are all facets of this power that China is demonstrating today. World-class university system, well, I'm sure you people are familiar with reports that have been surfacing recently about the number of universities that are now figuring in the top 20 or the top 50 or the top 100. And every year, China's universities are increasing. India is unfortunately pales by comparison over here. It is a global innovator in science and technology. An interesting fact that I discovered was that in 1999, the World Intellectual Property Organization received 276 patent applications from China. By 2019, China was filing 58,990 patent applications, which is a 200-fold increase. And this is only in 20 years. And it has bypassed the United States in terms of filing of. So that speaks about its capacity for innovation in science and technology, and filing of patents is obviously one aspect of it. Biggest consumer of energy, attracts the largest amount of FDI, and it has a rapidly modernized. So if we take all these factors today, China is really a power to contend with. Okay, these points we've discussed. So since Deng Xiaoping, this march towards what China is now it's been a continuous process, and China is becoming rich and strong. And this has translated also into China talking of both things. One, that its development and modernization requires a peaceful environment. And therefore, it has laid a great deal of stress through the 90s, through the first decade of the 21st century, on stabilizing its neighborhood, on resolving conflicts, on pushing its neighbors with whom it had outstanding disputes in the direction of some kind of a resolution. And so on the one hand, they are stabilizing the neighborhood. On the other hand, they are also talking about the need to strengthen, deter external threats, and therefore modernization and so on. And its foreign policies, therefore, have also been crafted around that core objective of development and modernization. That was really the single-minded focus that Deng Xiaoping embarks on. Keep a low profile, don't take the lead in international affairs, and focus on becoming rich. That is really the route to becoming strong. Now, Xi Jinping's ascendance has been identified with this great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and this has been popularized since Xi Jinping comes into power as the China Dream. It means material well-being, so he announced that he would abolish poverty, which was made an official declaration by 2020. He spoke about a just and moral domestic order by 2049. And he speaks about now a new era of global preeminence from 2049, which is going to be the centenary of the establishment of the PRC. So you can see the movement now has reached a point where the transformation of its environs and how it looks at the world order and how it seeks to transform that is, China is poised on that particular. Let's now look at the components. This is the second section that I said that we would look at the components of China's grand strategy. So we'll quickly go through these because these are some very kind of basic statements like asserting sovereignty and territorial integrity. And we have seen that whenever it comes to the issue of Tibet or Taiwan or its the disputed islands in the South China Seas, China has taken a very, very strong, very belligerent, and a very aggressive posture. That as far as their idea of territorial integrity and sovereignty is concerned, there is absolutely no room for compromise. So that's something that has been very firmly established as non-negotiable. Building and strengthening China's comprehensive national power, which means that focus on your development and modernization, start investing money into, and which is why you see science and technology, you see innovation, you see expansion of education. All this has therefore gone into strengthening its comprehensive national power. Integration with the globalized economy, we've already seen that. Since the turn of the century, a greater and greater engagement with regional international organizations and institutions. In the general tendency to look at Xi Jinping as the most assertive leader in China, it's again forgotten that China's expansive outreach actually begins under the President Hu Jintao. The gentleman who was very recently silently taken away from the 20th Party Congress, not silently, but in full view of the cameras, we saw that the former President Hu Jintao was taken. I mean, that was an interesting moment. But it's actually that massive expansion comes about under Hu Jintao. And Xi Jinping takes it forward. So a large number of this China's presence in the world actually starts to take place under Hu Jintao, and that involved expanding propaganda organs. Okay, something like the Confucius Institutes, which I think Mumbai is familiar with. There is one Confucius Institute in Mumbai. But there are nearly 550 Confucius Institutes worldwide. And they have enrolled, according to latest statistics, 9 million students in almost more than 145 countries. Now, when you have a propaganda organ of that size and scope, clearly, it's not as if every country, in fact, in the last 5 years, we see the United States a pushback. So in the US, there were more than 100 Confucius centers alone. And these became the vehicles for spreading Chinese culture, values, and it came to the point when the last 5 years I was talking about that assertiveness and wolf warrior, when it became, those Confucius Institutes became a way of actually interfering with the universities and their agenda, what they could speak, what they couldn't, using the students to protest. And so some of the Confucius Institutes, particularly in the US, became very murky kind of organizations, and then we see this pushback. But the fact remains that there is still a large number of those institutes which are which are expanding China's cultural influence all over the country. And alongside this, which is basically to do with spreading China's image, is really the expansion of the media. So information is power, and controlling of information is greater power. And what the Chinese have understood is that, this is something that they have grasped very well, because if we look at the expansion of Chinese media in the last 5 to 7 years, it has again been phenomenal, powered by the enormous kind of resources that they have. And almost all of China's prominent state-owned outlets have an international presence across the world in all formats: print, electronic, social media. And it is working double time. So China Global Television Network is now becoming more familiar. As one of my Chinese friends told me, why should BBC and CNN be your only sources? You will also learn from CGTN what our perspective is, or our take is on the... we have English language newspapers which are now being targeted at English readers and speakers. So to cut a long story short, basically, media is now being used in a very, very calculated manner. And of course, that's yet another aspect which has drawn a lot of criticism, particularly from the West. It doesn't matter when they do it, when they use the same kinds of means to spread and to, popularize what they want, but, well, others can't. And then, of course, China as a major aid giver, aid as a means to expand China's influence. And here is a graphic which shows you where China is. You can see the bulk of its aid, development cooperation agreements, as they call it, are located in Central Asia, Mongolia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And then there is no signed agreement, but other forms of cooperation scattered across Africa. So it has a very huge presence in terms of its aid and investment. That is also becoming a very significant. This will actually show you that China's aid is continuously increasing. Aid programs, investment programs, and of course, 2020 figures, I was not able to get them very recent figures, but since 2020, they have also started to go in for preferential buyer's credits and anti-epidemic supplies. So a lot of aid has gone in the last 2 years towards epidemic-related issues. So I begin the third section, which is basically how to understand these dimensions of this power that China represents today, and what are the issues arising out of this power. So, as I mentioned earlier, that from the turn of the century, practically, the rise of China has become one of the most researched, one of the most written about, spoken about. Policymakers, practitioners of diplomacy, scholars, researchers have been engaging with this phenomenon of the rise of China. And the question that has been pervading this discourse has been, what does it mean for the world? Now, clearly, the main question which comes out of the dominant bulk, or the bulk of writings, which is essentially from the West, the dominant question is China going to upturn the world or change the world order or challenge the existing order? Or will China be status quoist in nature fundamentally? That's really what occupies them to a large extent. Will China just tinker with the rules? In other words, will it just try to force a change which would then bring about a certain situation which would favor the pursuance of their interests, or will they want a wholesale change in the rules and norms undergirding international relations? One other question is, will China's rise finally clinch the irresistible shift of global power to the East? Now, since the turn of the century, and even a decade before, the closing years of the 20th century had seen a big development, which was that the four Asian tigers and the dynamism of the East Asian economies had started discourse on the global center of gravity was shifting to the East, to Asia, and that the 21st century would be Asia's century. Now, in this discourse comes in the rise of China, and that will China's rise actually finally bring the Asian century into being? Of course, when we start talking of the Asian century and China's rise, a very important component in this is that Asian century can never come about simply by the rise of China. That the Asian century will depend upon the India-China equation. And that no Asian century is possible without an understanding of India. So that's a very interesting kind of a discourse that is. Finally, will China's rise and significance in world affairs, will it lead to a change in the kind of alternative developmental models away from the Washington consensus? Of course, we've seen in the last 2 decades, Beijing consensus, the Beijing way, or China trying. But to be fair to China, China has never tried to impose its way of governing or its way of development or its models. They have sort of said that China's example could be useful. And in our country also, we have had a big debate as to what should we learn from China and what we should not learn from China. So that's a big issue as well. But here is where history, culture, and China's articulation becomes significant. If you examine the positions that the Chinese leaders have taken or their speeches, they are also always talking in terms of how China's rise will be good for the world. That China's rise is basically about fostering mutually win-win partnerships. That China is basically going to be a good economic partner for countries. That China will not be a hegemon, it will not do what the West did, it will not exploit, etc., etc. So their discourse is all about how the Chinese way, which comes out of a very different cultural, historical matrix, is going to be, and they talk in terms of a moral order, of a just order, of non-hegemonic order. So point I'm trying to make is that we have a discourse out there, which the Chinese are promoting and which is, of course, being contested and countered. So these questions really are about this new phenomenon that we saw is dominating world affairs today. And the wellspring of the apprehensions since the last decade has been the Belt and Road Initiative of the PRC, and this has been identified more closely with Xi Jinping and his worldview, but it is important to understand that many of these ideas about the Belt and Road actually predate Xi Jinping also. That if we look at one, and okay, I'll come to that instead of jumping the gun here. So this Belt and Road has huge ramifications, and in fact, if we do a Google search and we type rise of China and we type Belt and Road, we see just about same volumes of information and material coming out. Most avidly studied, scrutinized, deconstructed. And the question is that this Belt and Road, which talks in terms of connectivities across the world, land and maritime, would it move towards reforming or remaking the world order. All right. So just a shortcut now to how it has been assessed in this voluminous literature, that one set of researchers and one set of writings talk about how the BRI will actually become a catalyst for reconstituting the world. The rapidity with which it is pushing infrastructure projects is going to bring about a much more accelerated pace of development across a wide swath of developing countries. A second set of writings talks about how the BRI is reshaping world's economic geography, that these connectivities are actually bringing together countries which were hitherto unconnected, which is drawing through these pipelines and so on, reaching resources in different parts of the country and so on. And finally, building geopolitical capacity for global presence. The bulk of the writings are located here. That how BRI is merely a vehicle for China to expand its geopolitical significance. But the core feature over here, when we look at what the BRI is all about and how it is projected by the Chinese, that it's essentially an internationalization of the PRC's developmental strategy. Since this is not going to be about the BRI, but how BRI is actually fitting into China's worldview, I will give the barest details about that. But the manner in which these connectivities are now being pushed have been identified by scholars as integrating China's national territory with the international territory. So it's a kind of a move from the internal to the external, and these connectivities, which will be geopolitical, geoeconomic, and geostrategic, will obviously give China a much greater heft in the world. Of course, now at this point we are only talking about how the BRI has been envisaged, how much of investment has gone into it. The very recent discourse has started already to talk about the BRI is a failure, but we'll come to that later, because in my view there is no such drastic failure as such that we are seeing. So here is just a quick view of what is conceptual, how the BRI is conceptualized. So there is a belt and a road, and the belt is about overland routes and the road is about maritime routes. And the roads in turn are divided into 6 economic corridors. There is the China-Mongolia-Russia economic corridor, the New Eurasia Land Bridge Economic Corridor, China-Central Asia, West Asia Economic Corridor, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, about which there is a huge amount of debate and very, very agitated kind of, angsty kind of debates in India. Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Economic Corridor. Now, the India is there because the Chinese have put it there. But officially, India has opted out of this BCIM corridor. India has taken an extremely opposing stand on the BRI. They have not participated in any meeting or any activity officially for the BRI. So this is what I meant, that the BCIM corridor predated the announcement of the BRI by Xi Jinping. So when in 2012 in Kazakhstan, Xi Jinping goes and announces this great project of the Belt and Road, the BCIM was going on before that. And the Institute of Chinese Studies, with which currently I am the honorary director of this institute, had been a part of the track to BCIM dialogue. And an amazing amount of work was done to facilitate connectivity among these 4 countries. So of course, when the BRI comes along, they put it in that, and bang goes India out of it. No part of this. So this is and the last one is China, Indochina Peninsula economic corridor. The two maritime routes, you see those blue dots basically. The first route starts coastal ports of China, you can see there. They cross the South China Seas, passes through the Malacca Strait and reaches the Indian Ocean. And of course, then it also gets extended into Europe. So that's one huge belt, road. And the second starts again from coastal China, crosses South China Seas, extends to the South Pacific. Now, obviously this, to the extent that we see this huge initiative, building China's geopolitical capacity, geoeconomic capacity, establishing a global presence, creating connectivities between its own territory and internationally, we are witnessing what has been dubbed by some scholars as, quote unquote, internationalization of the PRC's developmental strategy. Which means that essentially China takes its money, its resources, its experts, its labor sometimes, and moves across and helps the building of this infrastructure. There are ports and airports and roads and railway lines and telecommunication hubs and a lot more. There's a very interesting Chinese scholar by the name of Ming Hao, and I quote from him, he said, BRI, what's in a name? The BRI is an idea. It's a vision. It is underpinned by China's growing economic clout, yes. But it is a metaphor for China's ambition to transform the world in the framework of its own world image. I think that needs to sink into our heads. We are face to face. I mean, I personally resonate with this. It is an idea, it is a vision, but it is also a metaphor for China's ambitions to recreate a very different kind of a reality. He goes on to say that the BRI will herald a new global order which will be identified by China's political and economic principles. A new epoch, which in many ways can be compared to the idea of the West. Idea. And his point is that historically, the dominant power has always animated global discourse with an idea. So, it was with the West, and now it will be with China. And China has the capacity, it has the vision, it has the means to now translate this into reality. So, here is another one which gives you more details about which all countries that we will see this overland route and belt and road sort of moving through. And yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive kind of a way in which it is going to establish its presence. Okay. In addition to, obviously, this particular framework, we see that the Chinese have started to spread their investments across the world. One picture we saw in terms of its aid program and so on. It has created new instruments. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank. It has moved towards the internationalization of the RMB, which is the currency, it moved in 2008, it had started to move towards this. Greater engagement, proactive stance towards, I've already mentioned this, but now when we study the way in which China is behaving and interacting in these multilateral organizations, we will see that they are taking a much more proactive role in leading the discourse. And now they are pushing very actively for a common security discourse. So clearly this influence, this newly gained economic clout is now being used to influence a certain new kind of discourse on critical issues before the developing world. Issues about development, issues about modernization, issues about security, and how security and development are interlinked. Xi Jinping's 20th Party Congress speech is a very, very good example of how he has fused the notion of security and the idea of development and made development itself a problem of security. So we've already discussed soft power and how China is using its Confucius institutes and its media to project a reality about BRI, which sometimes may not be the case. We have seen that the projection of a certain idea about what's happening with the BRI, with the reality that happens in some countries, and this has taken a great deal of space in our own media about China's debt diplomacy and how it is using the BRI and the funds that Xi Jinping has put for the BRI funds to push countries into debt trap. All right. We'll leave that for now, but that's a big debate that has started. And finally, China's move to expand and enhance its military and military modernization, military capabilities and resources. This is just another picture about how much it has invested in the BRI. I won't go into much details, but you can see the amount of money that has been thrown into the number of countries here, from developed countries to the developing countries. And I here recall a very interesting quote from Ferdinand Braudel, who said, "Capital and credit have always been the surest way of capturing and controlling a foreign market. So there are obvious dangers which we need to be aware of." And then in 2017, we have Michael Spence, a Nobel laureate, describing China as the global economy's new rule maker. He says that China's position in the global economy is starting to resemble that of the US during the post-war period, when it, along with Europe, was the dominant economic power. For decades after World War II, Europe and the US represented well over half and nearly 70% at one point of global output. And they were not heavily dependent on markets elsewhere, other than for natural resources such as oils and minerals. So his study shows, again, with a reference to historical trajectories and historical cycles, that we have reached a point where a certain transition is coming about. And economically, we see very interesting correlations between the time of the rise of the West, particularly the US, in terms of its complete dominance in the global economy, with China's moves now. So, and see, even if we take all these details and figures with a pinch of salt, even if half of it is true, it is still a pretty formidable kind of a resource. Okay, now this is the final section where I am going to essentially talk about how, in face of the big debate and the huge criticism that has started to come out about the BRI, as I said, that there is a very interesting pushback from some countries where China had moved in. More importantly, the argument that China's BRI could not be sustainable over a long period because of because of their attempt to impose certain kinds of ways of development, that is going to be resisted. And fundamentally, this was unlikely to do. I mean, it wouldn't last the length till 1949. So this kind of criticism, and clearly a big pushback is now coming out of the United States. So the Chinese strategy, because they are obviously, if you look at their writings or their speeches or their documents, they are hugely confident. And what we have seen in the last 2-3 years somewhat of a pause. Of course, the pandemic was hugely responsible for bringing about a little lull in this whole BRI-related investments and so on. But we have the Chinese policymakers going back to the drawing board. There is a rethinking about how they should adjust their strategies to the new reality, address the concerns that are coming out. And this is one thing that I find about the Chinese very, very interesting, this ability to pause, take stock of what the reaction has been, and then try and see how to adjust themselves to it. So this flexibility, which I referred to earlier in tactics, arises out of a clarity about what your strategy is all about. So now what the Chinese have done, adopted two broad strategies to deal with what they see now is the challenge coming out of the US and the US-led alliances and the US attempt to cobble together an opposition in China's neighborhood. So with particular reference to the BRI. So the first bit, the first strategy basically is sidestepping a direct confrontation from the United States. This is something that, see, it's important to remember that if we take the Sino-US emerging confrontation and Chinese apprehensions about what the US challenge means, they are very clear that they are no match militarily or technologically for the United States. And that is why they would not, in fact, in my opinion, all this talk about China ready to now take over Taiwan and domestically, if Xi Jinping feels threatened, he will take over Taiwan. I am pretty confident that the Chinese will not do any such thing. But the fact is that since the late 1990s, the complete dominance of the United States in the military field, because of its ability to undertake this global strike. I mean, that is something that the Chinese understand that they are no match for. And US has established a degree of military superiority which has rarely been seen in the modern state system. No competition as far as nuclear warheads are concerned, no competition still, although the Chinese are very rapidly trying to catch up, but new cutting-edge technologies, US is still heads and shoulders, nano, bio, Gen Next kind of things. So here the Chinese therefore have decided that they are not going to enter into any sphere which brings them into direct confrontation with the United States. They continue to push back. They will take very strong stands. Verbally they will make statements, but no actual kind of confrontation. And therefore the first is to conceptualize and work their connectivities, that the BRI, in such a manner that you bypass the US directly. So the CPEC, which we are so bothered about, is basically to enable China to bypass the Malacca Straits. And Malacca Straits, as we know very famously, was described by Hu Jintao, the former president, as China's Malacca dilemma. That if the Malacca Straits was choked off, China would starve. Its energy, it would be starved of energy. So that's the CPEC on the one hand. Then you see all these railways, which I showed you, all these economic corridors, railway lines from China to Europe. Basically avoid shipping your goods from the sea, where the US is still in complete dominance. So you move towards the land. European corridors, investments that there, they are tying up with them, basically. And moving into these ports and these corridors, which opens up the scope for competing with the US on their own territory in goods. So it's not as if they are, going to get in fight. They've opened a maritime road from China to the Pacific, which opens up Latin America. And then there's also a future of art. The second strategy is about nibbling at the margins, which is that they have started to establish strong linkages between their investment strategies and these new institutions like the AIIB or the NDB. Xi Jinping announced the setting up of a Silk Road Fund. Huge amounts of money are going into that. So alternative financial mechanisms are established to help them finance their BRI. And related to this is passing currency swap agreements with a number of countries. With BRICS accepting India, they have established currency swap. The EU, they have had this agreement. Pakistan, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Switzerland, all of them. So this is another way in which they are seeking to bypass the US dollar dominant financial system and markets. Okay, now I am going to wrap up my presentation by looking at this this whole question of the implications of China's BRI as a geostrategic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic framework, implications of this for China's global strategy and worldview. So it's clear now that this BRI can be assessed within the framework of China's global strategy. And we've seen, and as I said, that the important thing is this interlinking of China's domestic space with the international. That's really a very interesting dimension of this. It has risen. Obviously, the pandemic has slowed everybody down. There are still a lot of debates about whether China's growth is going to sort of go further down or China is going to once again pick up, and clearly at this point they don't seem to be showing any signs of real serious problems. But the important thing is that with all this background, how do we assess the 21st century? Now, it is quite clear that we are up against a huge new phenomenon, and the discourse is that the 21st century is going to have the stamp of China on it. So, it's not as if there is, this statement can be taken as non-contestable. China's rise can easily be debated in terms of possibility of reversal, that it's not as if this is completely set in stone. There are other contenders in the meantime who are emerging, who are also likely to play a big role in shaping this 21st century. So the fact that China has this vision, it has the capacity, it has so far demonstrated the will, and more importantly, the global perspective, that it is likely to take, it's full of determination to take its ideas to fruition. But these are not two sides of the same coin. In other words, whose century and whether China's rise is inevitable. Okay, so these are two different propositions, and it's clearly not a transformation that is going to come about very soon. The situation that we are seeing today about how this BRI is unfolding is not something, again, that came out in the last 10 years or 15 years. It has come, the wherewithal with which China is pushing the BRI has taken 50 years to build. So it's not just Xi Jinping coming along and having this and putting it. It's taken a long time for them to reach this point where they have now embarked on this great vision. And it's going to take them still a bit more longer to be able to bring it to fruition. But incrementally, intermittently, we see them moving. And the Chinese, of course, say that we are in an epoch where changes are taking place, the likes of which have not happened in a century. So shifts that happen once in a century are obviously going to be both very destabilizing and very uncertain. There are different sets of implications from both, whether China succeeds or fails, and both have very serious implications for India. An unfriendly China that rises and a China that fails, both will have highly negative consequences for India. But that's another story. So maybe some other time. But I would like to conclude with this thought that we are now facing up to a phenomenon that is going to bring about changes seen only once in a century. How prepared are we for it? What is the extent of our understanding of the problem? Is it significantly or sufficiently aware of the kind of strategies that you will need? And it's not just one strategy that you can adopt. You will have to think in terms of a number of strategies, which will require tactical adjustment from time to time, but a number of strategies to deal with this. I'd like to finally make a point again about this Asian century, that is China's BRI going to bring this shift to the East, that the era of the dominance of the West will be over, and that the Asian century will be marked by this dominant power called China. And I'd like to say here that, repeat what I said earlier, that the Asian century is not possible without an India-China understanding or framework. China cannot stamp the Asian century with its own image, having an unfriendly India poised up against it. But a more fundamental point here is that the India-China dynamics are obviously having a major impact in terms of international relations. And I think both India and China have not sufficiently thought about the impact of these international dynamics on the Asian context. So I think there are huge questions before us. I think we have to give much more time, effort, resources, bring in many more people who are actually studying this phenomenon called the rise of China. And thank you all for your time and patience.